This is It's Not In Your Head podcast with Dan and Juz. Dan is a doctor and Justine a pain coach. We've come together to find ways to manage complex chronic pain better for both patients and providers. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of It's Not In Your Head with Justine Feidelson, here with Dr. Dan Bates. Hey Dan.
Hey Juz, how are you?
Pretty well. How are you doing?
Yep, great.
Solid. All right. Today, we are going to be getting into a more conservative pain management topic, which is near and dear to my heart because I don't have a choice. We're going to dive into pacing, which is basically energy management and how over time you create more capacity and allow your body to have less blowback to the activities and the things that you need to do in a day. The challenge with pacing is that it often feels like a very sort of negative concept where you're giving up more things that you've lost or, being willing to do less. But pacing is not about doing less. It's about over time being able to do more. And like Dan says, it's how you take back what you've lost. And so to me, pacing is not this negative, sad, depressing thing. And in general, acceptance does not have to mean resignation. I think that's a really nuanced topic that people get a little confused by sometimes. And the way that you pace and where you start is also not going to be the set of limitations that you have forever. The whole goal of it and its purpose is to allow you to do more over time. So some kind of funny quotes that Dan and I have tossed around and that I often say or share with people is, some are less funny, more serious, but I'll throw a couple out there where, so the first one's not funny.
I know, these are.
Well, pacing takes planning. That's not funny. It's just true, right? Pacing is not about doing less. It's about being less stupid. That's kind of true. One of my friends, Carla, and I will say,
guess where that saying came from?
It was not Dan.
Yeah.
So, it was me, right? And then that piggybacks along with be brave, not stupid. These are all just kind of funny, but true ways of getting at it is about just acknowledging that at this point in time, you have certain limitations that you want to be able to work within because you have like this much capacity and you're bubbling over. So before you can do more, you have to be able to manage that capacity a little bit better.
One of the things that we want to highlight today is we're going to go through a bunch of different pacing techniques and create a bit of a structure.
Yes.
But it's hard to do. And actually, what I'm going to ask you at the end when we get through this is how many of your pacing rules did you break to actually be able to make this episode? So,
or record us recording this.
Yeah, to be able to record this episode, because I know it's not zero. So,
no.
But that's also being realistic about it. Like
yes.
This creates, we'll go through a strategy and a structure, but life gets in the way. And
right.
And
that's normal. Right. And it's okay.
It's normal.
And it's not, yeah. And so it doesn't mean that you can never send it and you can never push it. I talk very openly, right, about like when I struggle and what are the reasons why. And it's because I chose to do more than I could. And that's okay. It's not even a bad thing. It makes you a human. But having these sort of strategies in there allow you to recover faster, have that happen less often, and be able to pull yourself out, right? So if you think back to our flare management episode, that's where we talked about what happens when you basically don't pace, right? Then you got to go listen to that.
There you go.
Right.
And we'll do a quick review of the flare management at the bottom of this, because let's be honest, if you don't flare sometimes when you're pacing, you're probably not trying hard enough.
Exactly. Yeah. So go back and kind of check those out from a flare, also goal setting perspective. We'll touch on goal setting within the context of pacing and, how do you use pacing to basically avoid the boom and bust cycle more and end up being able to meet your goals, right? So what we hope comes out of this episode is that pacing gets a bit of a rebrand and a reframe where it's not this negative, horrible thing where you're, again, acknowledging to doing less. It's a way for you to gain resilience and combat the hopelessness and the frustration that comes from when you are in vicious cycles of uncontrolled flares. And every patient that I work with that has out of control pain does not pace and has really bad recovery. So you have to respect where your nervous system is at. What is it telling you? And then over time, push those boundaries further out. So that's what we'll get into with this episode.
All right. So we're going to head into planning.
Step one.
So we're breaking planning up into three components. So planning around timing, planning your tasks, and then tolerance, because we love a bit of alliteration.
Sucker for alliteration, yes.
So timing, tasks, and tolerance, sort of break them down for us, and how do you go about doing that?
So timing is really looking at what is your schedule? What's your routine? How much time do you have in the day? And when do you want to do what? as far as certain tasks. How do you want to spread them out? What days or, periods of the week do you have more energy, less energy? Is it going to be better or worse to do certain things? So looking kind of at the lay of the land from a timing perspective and how you manage the usable hours that you have in the day, which are different for everyone, right? The amount of hours you have total is not the amount of hours you can use. So getting a more realistic sort of perspective on that. Then breaking down the tasks, right? What do you want to do and accomplish? And what is really hard is being diligent about the things you have to do for yourself, sometimes first, before doing things for others. But whether it's self-care stuff, whether it's things around your daily life, or once you get into work, right? Passions, hobbies, pursuits, fitness, things that you want to do beyond the must, right? What do you need to do? What do you want to do? And then your tolerance, right, is really acknowledging and understanding and having acceptance, like we talked about before, around where are you really at right now? What's your context? What are your stress pieces? How out of control are some of those aspects that affect your capacity? And then working within that tolerance for where you're at with the pacing strategies. And as we get more into the strategies, you'll see some apply more to different parts of where you're at with pacing.
Okay, so let's break down timing a little bit more. So when you're looking at timing, and actually maybe let's start at tasks.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there about doing tasks for yourself, tasks for others, and then tasks that you want to do outside of that.
Yeah.
So how do you identify what those are and then start to batch them and then lay them out over time? So break down, tasks for you, tasks for others, and tasks that you want to do outside of those two things.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of the to-do list, right? When you think about errands or like those type of, what things do you do daily, whether it's self-care for brushing your teeth, showering, preparing lunch, right? Food. It's really easy to underestimate how much time it takes a week to like feed yourself and take a lunch. That's 7 hours, technically, if you do it every day, right? And then what things do you have to do for others? Is it picking your kids up? Is it stuff with your spouse? Is it things around something that you're doing maybe part-time as you would want to integrate more? So really, it can be helpful. I'll have patients sometimes, even on an assessment, I'll have them talk through a typical day of theirs, and I'll observe and listen to how do they explain? What do they do in the morning? Then what do they do? Then what fills their afternoon? Then what do they do at night? And it's really interesting to hear how sometimes people skip over like massive chunks of the day, and there's very little sort of awareness or like, oh, what happens then? Whereas other parts of the day, their breakfast routine might be very specific and sort of something that they're more diligent about. So identifying maybe where there's windows of the day where you're kind of just absentmindedly like going through them, or windows where you are more aware about what you're doing and why. And so first, it can be helpful to just take an inventory of what is a typical day for you like, when do you do certain things, and where could you put things that you either want to or currently do not have the capacity to do. You might have the time, but you don't have the energy or the bandwidth.
Yeah, so that's the way you sort of think. You're basically tasks. You're sitting down doing
you got to take an inventory
list. What sits into the bucket of things that you want to do that aren't necessarily things you have to do.
Right. This one kind of ties into goal setting more so, right? What do you want to achieve and what does it take to get there? Are these physical goals? Are these cognitive goals? Are these emotional goals, right? Are they, for me, we'll talk about it later, but like joining chorus, right? Adding an activity for joy, for something that gives energy to my life is also a major thing to try to, integrate and accommodate. So if you want to do something, you have to break down what does it take to get there, right? What does it require from a physical perspective, from a cognitive perspective, from a time perspective, and start to put that into your schedule. So even like as I shift into doing more work for the podcast, I've started to put windows of time into my schedule even this week, even though I'm not going to be doing that till next week. Because I need to create the space for that. And then it's in there, if that makes sense, when I kind of am able to utilize it. So if you just try to go from, I'm not doing anything to, I put all this stuff in, it can be kind of overwhelming. So giving yourself a bit of a adjustment period before is also helpful.
All right. So how do you task batch and task switch? So what are you doing like with that? So now you've got your
stuff, you got stuff you want to do, right?
You got your to-do list written down of I've got to get all this stuff done.
Yeah.
Like what's task batching and task switching?
So task switching is a little bit more of a negative. Typically, I should say rather, that's something you want to avoid. Sometimes it can be a helpful strategy to make something that is too long or overwhelming or daunting in one stretch, break it apart, and then you would technically be, switching from that to something else rather than doing it in a long stretch. But task switching drains you of energy often. So like in my own work, if I'm going between admin stuff, client work, doing a post, meeting with Dan, right, some other creative work, then I have a mentorship meeting. Oh, then I have stuff that flowed to the evening. Sadly, that's kind of typical, but what makes it hard is that there's a lot of task switching and different things that require different types of being on, right? Me doing Zoom calls with clients is a very different on type of energy than doing a bunch of creative work or back-end stuff. And so batching similar types of work together that requires similar types of energy or similar types of thinking processes helps you leak less of that in between. Also, if you're neurodivergent, transitions are hard anyway. And so it's in all those transitions that you get a bit zapped. So batching can help do less of that switching. And also, if you want to spend 3 or 4 hours a week doing something, you got to put it in somewhere, right? So if I want to devote 4 more hours a week to the podcast than I was, it's helpful for me to put 4 hours, whether I do 2 and 2 or whatever, into my calendar, and then that will happen. So it's also a way for me to see how is my energy balanced? Because if you don't have visual representations of that, it's very hard to monitor, let alone be aware of.
Yeah. I think about this in a similar way. I think about it as like in a gym type scenario where what you might want to achieve 2 different things. So let's say that you might set a gym session. And when I think about gym, I then think about the garden, because like the garden's like the green gym. And so when people are like working in the garden, you can think about it in a similar fashion. So if you're in a normal gym, you might do, shoulders one day, upper body, guns the next, and then legs.
Dan does guns every day.
And then back. We always do guns.
Always do guns.
That's important.
Always do guns. It's the most important muscle in the body.
Okay, I'll give it, so sideline, it must have been about 5 years ago, there was this shift in Australia to not doing guns. Okay, so everyone stopped doing guns while in the gym.
Really?
And then, it was
fascinating.
So everyone shifted away, like, you shouldn't be doing so much guns. And then what ended up happening is I had this big stream of people coming in with, like, bicep tendinopathy. I'm going, like, why have all of a sudden am I seeing all these biceps tendinopathy?
That's really funny.
Because everybody was, like, because everyone forgets that when you actually lift,
you kind of need your biceps.
You kind of always use your guns. Like, there's just not a point in time when you don't.
They're not just for
looks.
Except
maybe when you're doing pure quads, maybe. But even that, you hang on.
No,
anyway. So anyway, getting aside. So yes, always do your guns.
I have a lot of things wrong with me, but it won't be bicep tendinopathy.
Okay, right. So back to the point. So you can split your day. So you can batch back, batch legs, batch chest, whatever. Or you can switch.
Like a full body resistance.
I do a lot of the time is, so what I would do a reasonable time, I might do upper body and lower body same day, because what I'm doing is I'll maintain intensity and shift between. So my rest for upper limbs, I'll do lower limbs, and then rest for lower limbs, I'll be doing upper limbs. And so I actually increase the amount, like the speed at which I'm doing things, but I'm offloading the muscle during the other work cycle. And, so that's active switching rather than batching everything into one day where you're going to get massive
sore. It's physical pacing. And actually, that's exactly what I do, for example, with people who are highly sensitized, right? Nervous system bubbling over. If you can switch between what you're activating, it decreases the toll than like even a full body movement, like a hinge or a squat. That's a bit more of a zap because you're using everybody or more at once than switching between or a smaller part of your body. So totally makes sense, even for Dan.
So, all right, you put together your list and then you're going to put it into time. Like, what are you using to time things out throughout a week? And I know what your timetable looks like. So you're using your timetable, and how are you structuring it to get your stuff done?
Should we just kind of go through like a calendar example that puts some of these in play? Okay. Because what's interesting about this, and Dan and I had a little, talk previously before we started recording too, is really what you're trying to do with all of this from like a 30,000 foot view level is manage your energy, but you're using time. Like, time is a construct. You can kind of joke like, what is time? You're using time though to have a sense of how much load and toll and what are we doing when. So it's all in an effort to better balance your energy and how you're using it right throughout a day and throughout a week. So for example, I will do, and we'll get into the shifts that I made because of chorus, but Mondays on purpose are lighter, sort of back end creative, right? I do newsletter, blog content for my business, Resilient Warrior Coaching. So that's a lot less stressful than other types of work. Then I meet with Dan. That's fun. It's work, but I enjoy it, right? It's not like a stressor. And then I'm batching and piggybacking podcast work after that. So that helps me only do 2 types of things on Mondays, basically. Yeah, there's a lot of different types of work in there, but it's RWC stuff, back end, creative, knocking out posts, and then it's INEA stuff, less task switching. Then Tuesdays and Wednesdays, those are my front-facing client days, right? So I'll try to put more people in the mornings because I am better in the mornings. It only gets harder as the day goes on. And in the afternoons or evenings is when I'll put more meetings if I can help it, mentorship stuff, right? Other things, working out with my assistant or back-end stuff when it's past the more challenging things. Again, less task switching because I'm prioritizing clients on those days. And then you can fit some of the other things in around it. I will also, right, put my gym, my workouts in there. And that will be something that typically is, see, that's one that I will slide around. So like for this week, it got a little compounded into Thursday and Friday together, not ideal. Typically I'd have days apart, but I shifted a workout over on purpose because my Wednesday was crazy, right? So we'll get into being able to shift or move some things when other things you cannot to try to even out the overall balance. And then Thursdays, that's a workout day, right? And then we also have podcast meeting and podcast work, ideally after the meeting. And there's a ton that, gets put in the cracks, or I do write posts every day. That's not in here, or some of the other things that don't get done Monday. But if you at least have a calendar where you can see, right, what types of things am I doing in what windows? And it doesn't mean you never break the rules or you don't, shift, or you can't have complete control over this, but it gives you a better flow. And again, routine is the antidote to stress. And it's less of this like knee-jerk reacting then to different types of things all the time. And then Fridays are what I have made my like quote unquote rest day, where at least there aren't things scheduled then because I don't have weekends anymore. Saturdays are podcast recording, Sundays are chorus. Sundays used to be my one day of like, I don't have any obligations, and I've had to move a bunch of stuff around to try to make Friday that day so that I have one day out of the 7 where I am not in a constant state of there's stuff to do, I got to prepare for or recover from. And you need a day to recover and to push things over to that will not and cannot get done on the days you sometimes would like them to. So that's just a little bit of like insight into how I put different types of work in different windows so that there is some predictability, but still room for me to change or the context to change. Hope that's a little helpful.
I need to do all of that stuff too.
I can do dance
like my management strategy is work all the time and like
see where stuff goes.
Yeah, and just fit everything else in around.
Mine's like work all the time, but put things in specific windows to minimize
the whole consulting all the time doesn't work.
No.
Anyway, so you've tasked, laid out in time. So how to then manage your fatigue and your pain? So this is where tolerance comes in. What are the things you're looking at when you're going, okay, I've planned all that, but my leg's killing me.
Right.
Or, et cetera, et cetera. How are you managing the tolerance to actually then go on and do your stuff?
So that's kind of the built-in flexibility and the pressure release valve piece. So as much as I schedule in, I think I don't have any people's names on here, right? There's also windows of not, if you're looking online, this isn't perfect, but there's also windows of not doing stuff, right? And so you can see in gray, the gym, that would have been on Tuesday, but that would have created a crazy day, which I know I'm going to really then pay for on Wednesday. So I slide that guy over, right? So you have to take a lunch, like things like that I was more intentional about that I didn't used to be. And when you have more pain or you have less capacity, you have to have more flexibility and be willing to have a couple things fall off the to-do list. Because I think what's hard sometimes to realize is not everything on the to-do list has to or will get done. And there are plenty of things that one thing has like 4, it's many hours of tasks. Like one to-do list is 4 things. I'm not going to get that all done then. I know it's going to be kind of do some of it, slide it over. Do more, slide it over. By Thursday, it's checked off, but I had it in there since Monday to kind of chip away at. So when I'm doing better or worse, those are the things that I have to accommodate more and accept more when I'm doing worse than when I'm doing better. And you don't have to change the plan as much when you're doing better. You can kind of Push
Yeah.
it more.
I think that there's a couple of techniques that are published on this. One's called energy enveloping, which is effectively, I think it was published in 2013. But basically what they're doing is that you're basically looking at your pain or your fatigue and you're managing yourself within this
window of tolerance
budget. This window or this budget of fatigue or pain that that you can tolerate. And the other one is then within that is probably mindfulness pacing, where you're at this point where you are paying attention to where your body is at relative to the load that you're doing. So you might go, you know what, today's just not it. And you're dropping back, or actually today's it, I'm on, let's go. And you can load up a little bit more. And which is interesting because I think a lot of the patients, particularly with, chronic pain, have ASD, and so generally patients with autism spectrum disorder have got crappy interoception.
Terrible.
So interoception is a big word, but it's essentially just a sense of your own body,
internal awareness.
Having internal awareness, and when it's bodgy, well then.
And that's just, am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I stressed? Am I sad? Right? It makes it hard to identify emotions that you really feel. It makes it hard you get stuck in hyperfocus and flow, right? I trap myself. I cement myself to the chair. I become a chair. And then I'm like, why does my back hurt? Well, right. And I'm not special. Right. And so the same consequences happen to me. And as your capacity changes, right, that's where look at your recovery, look at your stress. You have to manage your nervous system. And that's why not having anything Fridays is important, because it doesn't mean I don't do anything Fridays. It means the stuff I couldn't get done Monday through Thursday gets pushed to Friday so that I don't die Monday through Thursday. And there's overall a much better balance. And then I'm not stressed that things aren't getting done because I know I have room, right? I've created space to accommodate. I can't do that now. And that also helps the anxiety and the sort of stress and the frustration. So
I do that as well.
Yeah.
But what happens is my staff keep on coming into me and say, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? I'm like, I'm trying to catch up on all the stuff I haven't done. Dan, can you do this? I say, oh my God. Okay. It's sort of like.
I know. Dan fully AI'd. Dan AI'd his clinic and managed to get busier somehow still. You're supposed to earn yourself time.
Not completely AI'd. We will get there.
Semi. Yep. Yes. And tolerance is a changing variable. So that, comes down to awareness and being willing to acclimate.
I think that one of the other reasons why I just wanted to bring up the mindfulness piece is that mindfulness gets thrown around as you just have to be mindful.
Yeah, what is that? Yeah.
You got to put it into a context for some people that lack,
interoception.
The ability to interoception, like your internal awareness. But it's really hard. Right. And if you've got ADHD, mindfulness, pretty tough.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to say exactly.
Mindfulness, we're probably not friends.
Right.
But I see it it's definitely it's an exceptionally valuable practice.
Concept,
You got to be fair as well that some people just can't do it. So you've now moved through the process of having created your tasks, batched them, laid them out time, and you've got an understanding how you're managing your tolerance around things and different techniques to, build. And what techniques are there to go on and then execute on the pacing, for which there is a bazillion different ones?
Yeah. So, and with pacing too, right? It's figuring out what techniques work for you. Just like we were just talking about with mindfulness, it's not going to be what speaks to everyone. So don't, try to squeeze a square peg into a round hole and force yourself to do something that does not match with your nervous system or your learning style. So with the execution piece, it comes down to, again, differentiating a little bit between cognitive pacing and physical pacing, right? Pacing your positions, right? For me, how long I sit, how long I stand, and switching those in a way that pain doesn't become so intrusive that it makes it hard for me to think and work cognitively is different than me managing what I'm working on, when and how much to manage my cognitive load. So these overlap a bit, and you need to be aware of what things positionally or physically, like if we were talking about working out and things that are not cognitively taxing, what things like that tax you. And so these things, especially the positional stuff, comes down to discipline and, just being honest with yourself that if you don't want the consequences of not doing so, you have to be more diligent about integrating the things that work for you. Things are going to change. You will flare, right? Things are going to go not the way you want, but you have to be able to stick to your plan, not your limits, because the limits change whether for better or worse, the plan is what you need to be consistent, and then you progress that over time. So being able to measure what you're doing, right? We talked about from an organization perspective, look at what you're doing that week and then stick to it. And then over time, you can actually build as you gain more capacity and you decrease basically your stress response. So there's a lot of specific techniques that you can go to around triggering regular breaks. You can use the Pomodoro technique. Do you want to explain that one, Dan? You knew that one as well.
Yeah, Pomodoro technique is
common.
Really
I can do the other ones.
I think it's a 25-minute cycle.
25.
So it's 25 minutes.
25.
25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. So I've tried to use this over time.
Dan would never do this.
Particularly when I don't know. I find it okay, particularly when during a phase when I was doing a large amount of study, it was good because you could just basically put on the timer and then go hard for 25 minutes, make sure you didn't get distracted, and then have 5 minutes of walking downstairs and patting the dog. So I found that technique to be quite useful for that.
Yeah.
That said, I don't use it for anything else.
Yeah.
It's sort of only been what I've used it for.
That makes sense.
Other things which I think we've already sort of mentioned was the quota base. So where you set a goal and you're going to then hit that goal, or you're going to do a time, I suppose Pomodoro fits into that.
Right.
Where you're going to hit a specific time and you're not going to pay attention to your pain and your fatigue during that period. And so what that is about fear avoidance.
Right.
So that might not be the right thing for people, but if you've got a large amount of fear avoidance, instead of managing based on your perceived symptoms,
the output of the fear around it.
Yeah. So you're managing on your fear. So when people are fear avoidant, they don't do stuff because either does hurt or it might hurt. And so in that setting, they go to do something and then they stop. Where what you want to be able to do is you want to go, actually, I'm going to focus on getting this done for 5 minutes.
Right.
You hit your 5-minute time.
Yeah, no matter how much it sucks. Right. As opposed to holding back so that you avoid the suck. Because for that person, the fear of the suck is the line you want to flirt with and change. Exactly like with CRPS or central sensitization, when you get extremely sensitized and intolerant to textures, temperatures, right? Your foot on the ground, your foot on the grass. And it's you start with 30 seconds and you work up to a minute and then 3 minutes and 5 minutes. And it's just the same concept, just with work or with tasks or other things that cause that rise in pain. Yep.
And I think that it's important to be able to recognize that what you're managing there is you're managing the fear. Right. You're not managing the pain.
Yes.
So in this setting, what's happening is that people are extending out the time that they're doing things. And so their fear is decreasing and their pain is not increasing.
Correct. Right.
So it's not the payoff.
Yeah, you're not just torturing somebody. Right.
No, that's not the way it works. Where these techniques fall down is where
you push through.
They get applied to somebody that is you're fear avoidant. And where they're actually not fear avoidant,
it's pain.
It hurts.
Yeah, it's promised.
And then they implement, and then they blow up afterwards.
Right.
So it's managing fear versus pain, and then there's other ways to then go about managing the pain rather than managing fear. And so
such a good differentiate. I love that. Yeah. And that's where desensitization goes wrong too, right? When you're pushed through pain, it's yes, you do need to, again, flirt with that line, get comfortable working through discomfort. But when you do that, you're really just reinforcing the pain and basically the fear response. So you have to respect where your nervous system is at while being willing to expose yourself to a bit more tolerable, appropriate discomfort, and then go from there. And then you don't have the fear amplifying the pain response, which is part of where it gets so tricky to begin with, because the fear already, it's setting you up for not a great experience. So then the next one, less sexy, is just to set reminders and alarms. Every time I suggest this to clients, they're like, no, I know it's intrusive and it's not the funnest, but it works. You set an alarm, it rings, you get up. So it's pretty basic, but that's one. 52-17 rule we put in here because it's something that if you're someone who is working, or again, a lot of people with ASD are highly productive and trying to be or want to be, and there are a lot of folks who are disabled and working, one of the splits you can try is 52-17, 52 minutes on, 17 off, which is something that from research they've found to be a good split for highly productive people, supposedly. So it's similar to the Pomodoro technique, just not 25 and 5. You can also try micro breaks. For a lot of us, 52 minutes is a bit long in one position, ideally. So 30 seconds every few minutes or a few minutes every 20 minutes are ways that you can sneak in breaks. And I like to use micro breaks always for movement. So don't just stand up like to stand. That's okay. But if you can use those breaks to sneak in some stability stuff, some things that help activate the musculature that I just did a whole entire webinar on that gets inhibited when you sit too much and stand and your muscles cannot support you in that position. This can kill two birds with one stone from that perspective a bit.
One point I want to make in there is if you're on the other side, so let's say that you're not the one in pain, but you have a staff member, a friend, a family member that is in pain, it's just be comfortable with them getting up and walking around and looking like they're not paying any attention to you.
Looking like they're miserable and uncomfortable. They're not. They're just managing themselves.
Because I think that becomes an important way that it allows that person who's in pain to actually manage their pain and not do it in a fashion where they're self-conscious and so we'll sit in a meeting for an hour or 2 hours, not contributing because they're in pain, and just trying to hold it all together, where you are better off as a boss, work colleague, blah, 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 just going, dude, just move. It's okay.
Right.
And just let them get up, walk around, do their thing, and then sit down again, because they'll be far more productive and they'll be far more a part of the meeting if they're not just managing their pain. So allow people to do it. It's good. You need to wiggle, go and wiggle.
Dan got over it quick with me. So it's just no way to not. And I was really glad you brought that up, because like I said, with the chorus example that we'll get into too, physically, a form of pacing for that is how I manage myself over not the 3 hours. Frankly, it's often 4.5 hours, right? I've gone early many times for other commitments that I didn't realize at the beginning were a part of it. So it's like extra practice Monday night, 4.5 hours on Sunday. It's like, that's like almost like a cross-country flight. And so it took me a few weeks to get over myself, even though, right, I teach people how to do this. I talk about this. I'm not ashamed of what I deal with, but in a large group, when you're trying to fit in, not stick out, it's hard sometimes to get on the ground and bring your yoga mat and bring your freaking ball and your bands and your little lacrosse ball and stuff. And initially I tried to just alternate between sitting and standing, just like I do on the podcast. That doesn't work for 3, 4, 5 hours. You need a third. I need to be on the ground too. And it means a lot, to me, when I can feel safe and comfortable in a space to do that and to be able to manage myself without feeling like a leper or like people are looking at like, what's wrong with her, right? And if anything, if you can bring yourself to do that, you get to be an example, where I'm not okay, but I'm okay, right? Like this is normal. Obviously I'm struggling, but I'm happy. I want to be here, and it's so much better when you feel that understanding and that you can be yourself instead of sitting there, gripping and, crying because it's just so uncomfortable. And then that starts to make you feel like you're miserable or you don't want to make other people unhappy or uncomfortable. And so it's much better if you can just be open and honest, and most people will be accepting and fine with it. And if they're not, then they're not your people. So,
and let's be honest, like crying at chorus doesn't really,
it's not a good look.
Doesn't really set the tone.
No, they almost kicked me out. I'm just kidding. But I almost kicked myself out because I was like, if it's this hard, it's not going to work, right? I can't do it then. So you have to figure out a different way. And
All right. So then one of the other things is then let's talk about the difference between graded exposure and activity pacing.
Yeah.
So graded exposure is a technique where you just gradually build things step by step over time. And so like I've got a couple of different, and we've talked about these different techniques that I use for patients. It's sort of like the letterbox technique where, you choose a letterbox and every 2 days you walk another letterbox and then another letterbox and another letterbox. What you've got there is that every 2 days you extend your walking distance by 30 meters. And so over time, you're having very tiny, gradual steps where you are not flaring up.
Yeah.
I also have a technique that I developed that actually came out of managing tendon problems, which is called the rule of twos. And so the rule of twos, you can turn the rule of twos into the rule of ones or the rule of halves or the rule of whatever you want. But the rule of twos works. And so the whole idea with rule of twos is that you exercise every second day. Right. So you have day on, day off, day off. So it's high load, low load, high load, low load. You don't want to have any consecutive days because, one of the things I noted, particularly when doing working with people who are getting tendinopathies, is that how many times do you run a week? 4. Okay. So that means you have to have 2 consecutive days. And so you don't get a recovery day. And surprise, surprise, people get overloaded. And so then at that point in time, I was looking at, well, you want to have your pain with tendons 2 out of 10, which doesn't work for chronic pain. Or no worse than usual is my add-on. So you can have work every second day and you want to be doing as much. That means that you're not flaring your pain so that it's worse than usual rather than it being 2 out of 10. But that 2 out of 10 works with the rule of 2s.
Yeah, it does.
So next part is then splitting it between what you're doing. If you're doing repetition-based exercises, so you then add 2 reps every 2 sessions. So you do Monday, Wednesday, you might do 5 reps, and then Friday, following Monday, you do 7 reps or something along those lines. Or you can just add 1 rep every couple of reps. Or if you're doing cardiovascular stuff, add 2 minutes every 2 sessions. 1 minute every 2 sessions, 30 seconds every 2 sessions. Once again, that's a variation on the letterbox technique. So you're just gradually building up.
Yeah.
And then the last piece was then that flare component. If your pain's greater than 2 out of 10 or worse than usual, take 2 days off.
Increase the days off. So adjust.
And restart at your previous pain controlled level. So the key there is I'd have a lot of people that go and they'll start doing this and they come back and they'd say, oh, I did this and I blew myself up. I'm like, okay, that's okay. It doesn't mean you did too much. You're just too much on that day. Prior to that, you were good. So let's say you were walking 20 minutes. Great. You then extend it to 22 minutes for whatever, and then you get worse. That's fine. Take a couple of days off. Go back to 20 minutes. Don't go back to 10. Don't go back to 0, which is what most people do.
And 10% is a good amount to cut, to go back or to shave off when that happens. That's perfect. 2 minutes out of 20. Yep.
And come back and go again. And I think it was that piece there where it went from I've blown up, I can't do this, to I've blown up, I'm going to take a step back to here. After some time off, I'm going to go again. That's, I think, what really shifted things for a lot of people.
That's what makes it actually work. That's what creates resilience and a completely different mindset and perspective of, oh, I can work through pain and you can keep progressing. And progress is inherently a shuffle. It's 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And when you're in the back slide, it does not feel good, but that's part of the constant push that way. So there will be periods where the same activity, that doesn't normally blow you up, blows you up, or just a little bit more. And sometimes it's good to look at those context pieces, because sometimes it's not the activity itself, but all the supporting surrounding variables that cause that activity to have more blowback. It doesn't mean don't regress the activity a little bit, but just from a curiosity perspective, that's how you analyze and learn, oh, I did that maybe happen. And then you can tweak that moving forward. And being able to work through that is what changes you long-term, not giving up.
And I think that is what becomes the difference between graded exposure, which is what I just talked through, all those things, and then activity pacing, where what you're doing is you're then changing that activity on the day relative to how you feel.
Yes, that's the differentiation.
And whether that be and everything else around you, you're changing. You're not pushing it regardless of what's taking place in the outside world. So there's a difference between graded exposure and activity pacing. And that becomes really, really important because they have their place, but they don't necessarily always work.
And it's what population and what individual are you applying, those strategies to, that will have an effect on how successful are you. Not all created equal.
So that is one of many, those are one of many
ways.
Techniques to manage your, to actually execute on getting your pacing done, I suppose. So then the next piece is then awareness and monitoring. All right, so from the monitoring perspective, so I do a whole stack of various monitoring pieces. I've got no association.
Dan's a data.
Yeah, I'm a data whore. I have an Aura ring. I have a Whoop. I use Morpheus as well.
Lots of paraphernalia.
Lots of paraphernalia, and Like I know you probably see I got a
It's
glucose
got- yeah,
monitor
yeah.
as well. For
He just
anyway,
wanted to show the guns. Just wanted to.
All right. So
Zone 2. Whoop.
what zone 2? So basically what I do with these, I use them for different reasons, but when we're talking about managing my load for a day, I look at mainly two things. So I look at what Whoop says with regards to a recovery, and then I look at and I run off what Morpheus says with regards to like where I'm going to stick my heart rate at a zone 2. So let me explain those two things. So Whoop is a monitor. It monitors your heart rate variability, your sleep, your blood oxygen, your temperature. I think that's about it. It then gives you this recovery rating that is essentially a combination between all those sort of things. And I think that one of the things that you need to understand, the way I think about a lot of these different things, is that all of these monitors are wrong.
Okay? Yes, they're not accurate. Yeah.
But
relative.
But they are consistently wrong.
Right.
So it's not
relative to themselves, they're accurate. They're just not precise.
They stay the same.
Right.
So Aura will tell me that my heart rate variability is 22. My Whoop tells me that it's 38, and then Morpheus will tell me it's 77. So beautiful. I like the Morpheus number because it because it says that I'm
super fit.
Heaps more, yeah. But my point is they all remain relatively stable within whatever their algorithms are. Right. So I think don't get too tied up with what the actual number is if you're using one of these devices.
The change of the number is what you should pay attention to.
It's the change from the number that is important. Yeah. And so within Whoop, it basically blocks it into your recovery, goes into red, which is 0 to 33%, and then yellow, which is 34 to 66%, and then green is up to 100%. And so what I've used Whoop for is I don't change my training if I'm in the yellow and green. So if I'm in yellow and green, I just go and do whatever the hell I want to do.
Right. You're good. Yeah.
If I'm in the red and I don't know why.
Right.
Now, I will be in red is if I've been on the terps the night before and had a couple of drinks with the boys. That will really, alcohol will tank my recovery.
Yeah.
But so then that's my fault. I'll go out and go for a run at any rate. But what's really interesting is what I notice is that my recovery will drop off quite significantly for no reason. I'm like, okay, what's going on here? Most of the time, one of the kids is sick.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so what I think is happening in this setting is that they're sick with something they've never been exposed to. So they get clinically unwell.
You just get a little knock.
I've got the bug, which puts off my heart rate and makes my recovery drop.
But you don't literally
But
feel
I'm not
sick.
Clinically unwell because you've got an immune response that's taking place. But it's at that point that I'll go, okay, I'll wind it back today.
Right.
This is an extra hour's sleep. This is not going to the gym.
Oh my God.
Not going for
Dan
a run.
Paste, it's a miracle. It happens.
Yeah, I do. So when it goes into red. So that's how I use that. The other thing that's interesting with Whoop is that I found that it also pushed me the other direction. So when it said to me, hey, you can go harder. So at the point in time when I wasn't sure about, okay, I feel I need to hold back, it would be going, no, you can do more than this. And so I actually went harder. And so I actually ended up doing more on my days on than I was doing before because it was like, you'll be right. Just keep going.
Yeah, but it's because but you push more when your body has the ability to push and you pull back more when your body's like, meh.
Yeah. So it was sort of like, so when I'm in the red, I pull back. When I'm yellow or green, I don't pay any attention, but I probably push it harder than I would.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you're right.
Green would be like send it for me, or yellow is like stay in your guardrails, stick with the plan. Red is like, ooh, we got to look at some of this stuff. Yeah. And this is what brings us to the conversation of, again, people with chronic pain or disabilities are no different than performance athletes. You are looking to optimize your performance. It's just not the same ceiling, right? No matter how much I want, I'm not going to be, old Justine with no CRPS and all the other stuff. It's not the reality, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't care about optimizing and getting the most out of what I am working with. And these type of metrics can be very, very helpful.
And it doesn't mean that these strategies don't work for you.
Right.
And I think that this is sort of like, I've ended up in looking after people with chronic pain from a sports physician perspective, because the techniques are exactly
and
the
this
same.
is why Dan and I, like, this is why we also click so well, because we have a very similar approach and perspective on how you'd manage people who aren't athletes, but they benefit the same.
Yeah. So the other thing I'm using is a thing called Morpheus. Morpheus is a heart rate monitor. Once again, it's a little bit more of a traditional type heart rate, like recovery assessment, where what you do is you wake up in the morning, put it on, it does an assessment of your heart rate variability after you've woken in the first 10 minutes. And you basically put into it, how did you feel? How did you sleep?
Oh, you input.
Bad. How sore are you? I'm about this sore. How much do you feel like training? Yeah, I'm pretty good. Let's go.
Right.
Or, yeah, not feeling it today.
Right.
And so then what it does is it then gives you its recovery rating. But the thing it does is it then picks where your training zones are. And so
depends
what I'm looking for is I'm looking to sit in zone 2. So zone 2 is this split between working with, we're getting a technical here, your energy system, which your mitochondria are producing the majority of your ATP. So ATP is the little molecule that we use for our energy. And when mitochondria are running the most, they dominantly use fat as an energy source, and they produce tons of ATP. And zone 2 is when we start doing a level of exercise that just steps over that.
Right.
And you then start using carbohydrates in form of glycolysis to then produce more ATP to supply the additional bit that you need.
Right.
And that's when you start producing lactate. So it's actually the tipping point between where your lactate starts going above 2, if you were measuring it. Now, I haven't measured it, and I haven't looked, but what happens is that it will give you a heart rate to sit at.
Yeah.
And that's what you target. Like, interestingly, like this morning, I actually had a really big day yesterday. Like I boxed in the morning, we sparred, I then like mowed the lawns and blah, blah, blah. So it was a big day yesterday. And today, like normally my zone 2 heart rate would sit at about 140, 142. And today it dragged it all the way back to 133. Yeah. And so like I'm ticking my legs over. And the interesting thing was, it was right. Like my heart rate was not going up and getting ready to go. So it's pretty, I kind of at least feel it's in the ballpark.
Yeah,
but they're just techniques and ways to go about estimating
the toll of, right. So when you get into, from a pacing perspective, movement, which is not what we're focusing this episode on, but that's a whole nother world of, how do you pace? And progressing movement is basically pacing movement appropriately for people like us.
And just to make sure we put this into a context, I haven't been using this in the setting of patients. Like I haven't got patients that I've
right. But I'm one. But that's the thing is like, Morpheus. But the more data you have as a patient, so that you can adjust, whether it's, because a lot of what we talked about was more from like a planning, scheduling, like organizing perspective. But when you get into what's the activity I want to do and what's the toll of that specific activity, how can you do it in a way that stays within your window of tolerance, and you push more when you can push more, you pull back. So that's a very, very good example. Totally applies.
And to be honest, I do have a couple of patients using Whoop for different reasons, but we could probably talk about that another time. So
we'll do a different data episode.
They do their thing.
Yeah.
So the next most important piece is, like, as we're talking about how you were trying to execute and how you're paying your awareness and your monitoring.
As you get more long-term.
What ends up happening? Eventually, it's a nice day outside and you're with a friend and you actually just want to do a bit more because you're human and you blow up. Or, like, because everyone is human, like, there's work stresses. One of the kids is sick. There's family stresses.
Normal.
There's all this other stuff. Your tolerance is down and you blow up. So I'm doing all chatting at the moment. Jazz, just take us through your 5 stages of your flare management. So what are you going to look out for? Yeah. And then what episode number is it to go?
All right. So Dan just talked about the triggers, right? So triggers, stressors in your life will fluctuate and vary, whether they're people, places, or things. So being aware of, okay, what's the status of my stressors, and sometimes they're good things, right? Chorus crushes me. Movement sometimes crushes me. It doesn't mean, it doesn't just come from bad things. So that's the first step. Then you start to get the loss of routine. For me, that's putting things in front of the self-care that we talked about at the beginning. Oh, what to-do list do I have for me? None. Let's just skip right to the to-do list for work, right? Or the things that I am passionate about. So that's where you start your fueling falls off, your recovery slips a little bit. Next thing you know, whoopsies, now I don't have the bandwidth to work out. And now I'm moving quickly towards worsening pain. And before you know it, you're in the hole. That's when then you get really sad, catastrophize, overwhelmed. Oh no, you got to reach out for help. And then you start to dig yourself out. So as much as this sucks, it is normal. And the whole point of pacing, like I said at the beginning, is to have it happen less frequently, have it be less intense when it happens, and have you feel a lot more in control and less panicked when it does. But the key is don't get past worsening pain. The worsening pain is when you really try to hold on,
try and avoid the hole.
Don't get in the hole. Yeah. Don't get in there. So as you start to feel, right, things are changing. My capacity is less. I'm more frustrated. My mood is worse. I'm more withdrawn. I don't have the energy to communicate or reach out. That's where we already went a little too far. But before then, that's where it kind of ties into nervous system regulation, or being able to have ways to downregulate from a mood or stress perspective, or desensitize if it's more of the physical sensitizations that kick up. And some, like how Dan went through some of these techniques, things that I'll use are things like release techniques to kind of help people bridge the gap of, ooh, that kind of feels a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit painful, but I'm working with it. I'm flirting with that line. I'm breathing while I'm doing it. And oh, now it kind of feels good. Now it's kind of soothing. And oh, I don't hate it. And so it changes that experience that you have and allows you to kind of bridge that gap between rest and excitation, right? When you're a little more sensitized, you go to work out, you're already kind of high strung, and then you rev everything up even more. And so if you can become a little bit more mindful about how you manage transitions when you have less capacity, progress aerobic stuff sustainably, right? Pull it back. And I'll use a framework where I'll have people go, it's theoretical, so bear with me. Let's say walk at a pace that they could sustain for 4 times as long as the pace you're actually walking at. So if you could walk at a pace for an hour that you could sustain theoretically for 4 hours, that's real slow. You're walking slower. You're cycling very slowly at a pace for 1 hour, you could sustain for 4. Most people can't start with 1 hour, so make that interval 15 minutes or half an hour. I don't care. But the pace is such that you could sustain it for 4. Then you do half an hour for a pace you could sustain for 2 hours, 15 minutes at a pace you could sustain for 1 hour. So it's always 4 times the time that you'd be able to sustain that you then or compared to what you're actually doing. And so that is, and you'll spend weeks, like I'll have people spend 6 weeks sometimes in one of those phases as they adjust to that pace. And then when you increase the pace, you decrease the time, you decrease the rest intervals in between, then there's all these variables you earn the freedom to make more challenging. But when you're in a state of, I'm getting, close, pull it back and do some of the things that, whether it's zone 2 or just is less challenging, still, helps from a vitality perspective. And then you can adjust and push it again, as you get the other surrounding pieces. So use, those techniques as you need them, and don't be afraid to pull back, because it makes it quicker that you can start to build again.
Okay. So did you want to go through chorus?
We've touched on it a bit, but basically, right, it was essentially Sundays were my full day off. So that's what creates then, if you want to integrate something that's pretty significant toll-wise, you have to create the rest around it to make it sustainable. So that's why then, instead of Mondays being a more intense day, right, I tried to make Mondays lighter, almost taking off the first half, but not really. I'm still doing work, just not taxing work. And then Fridays, I have made more of a full rest, theoretically. And, that takes a couple weeks to shift things over and move things in a way where you can clear something out and create the space before chorus, right? I need to have time to sort of get my body in the best position to succeed for it, and then be able to recover from it, and then manage it better when I'm literally in the activity, which we also talked about already. So it just creates kind of a trickle down effect. And it's a little bit like dominoes, where if you put something in, something's gotta, not go or give, but just get reorganized. So I'm not doing less, I'm just doing things different. But it took a fair amount of, shuffling and finagling. But now
I think everybody's clearly been nice to you and let you lay on the ground.
They've been nice.
And roll the...
Can you imagine if they were mean?
Bring your roller.
Yeah, what if they were like, get out of here?
Oh, mate, like a Mean Girls chorus.
A Mean Girls chorus. Regina George.
Yeah. Mean Girls chorus. Oh my God.
We wear pink on Wednesdays. It is like my favorite movie. So yeah, I mean, it's hard when you want to integrate something new because you do have to change things around it, but it doesn't mean you can't do stuff, right? I was very, very scared, very hesitant. I literally was like, there's no way I can do this. It's not possible. But if you really want to, you can kind of figure it out. And the worst case, right, you try something and you decide a few weeks or months in, you know what, I can't do it. But it's so much better to try and give yourself the chance and see if you can accommodate, see if they can accommodate, and then go from there. But yeah, sort of bookending it, right, with some recovery is key.
Okay, so I think like out of this,
like sweating now.
Pacing isn't a dirty word.
Yeah.
Pain will have taken away the things you love, and what pacing is about is it's part of the techniques of you taking those things back. And so you need to be thinking about how you plan, and that's planning your tasks and batching and batch switching, your timing with all those parts, and then how you manage your tolerance. So having some pressure release valves in there, being aware of what's happening for you from day to day, week to week, so that you can manage your stresses and increase your load and decrease your load as you need to.
Right.
The next thing is then going on to how you execute. And so there is a million different ways to be able to execute things, whether you split things based on time, whether you do graded exposure techniques, whether you're doing, true activity pacing where you're doing intervals throughout your day.
Whether you batch.
You then vary, whether you vary that interval based on how you're feeling, based on your fatigue and your pain at the time. And then it becomes really important to then be aware and monitor what's going on for yourself. Give yourself flexibility in your plan because life's going to get in the way. You need to be able to, you're not going to get it all done. Shift it to the next day or shift it a couple of days down the track. It's okay because that's just life. And then finally, you're going to flare up. It's okay. Know how to manage your flares. Know that if there's people, places and things that you've got, your mother-in-law's birthday on the weekend and there's people, places and things that are going to flare you, well, then that's okay. Just know that that's coming and change what you're doing. Look for your change in routine. Note that, your pain's starting to increase. Have those strategies in place to manage that early before you're in the hole.
Yeah. Is it sleep? Is it food? Is it what are the pieces that fell off? Yeah. Is it movement?
And then when you're in the hole, know who you people are.
Phone a friend.
To either sit there in the dark with you while you get your way out or how you call a friend.
Then you listen to episode 15, Anatomy of a Flare. Yeah.
All right.
Good summary.
Thanks, Jazz.
That was good. That is essentially it. And if you are, from a pacing perspective, right, at the stage that you are trying to move more or progress movement, whether it's underlying stability or the aerobic pieces we talked about, or how in the world do you progress strength appropriately and select the right exercises without blowing up, I'm going to be opening up and running my group movement program for complex pain patients called Complex Pain Progressions, CPP for short. So go to my website. I'll link that as well in the show notes. And you can check that out if you are, like I said, at the point that you're ready to start challenging yourself and integrating a little bit more from a movement perspective, once you have more of the surrounding lifestyle pieces integrated, which we went through in base camp. So reach out if you have any questions surrounding that. And otherwise, anything else, Dan? I think we covered everything that I wanted to.
Perfect. All right.
Beautiful.
That's good.
All right. Thank you, guys. We will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening. Clearly, this is a podcast. It's for informational purposes. It's not a consult, medical advice, or the practice of medicine, and it doesn't form a therapeutic relationship. If you feel the information might be useful for your situation, before applying it to yourself or others, you should speak with your doctor or your treating clinician. Do not delay in seeking a diagnosis or treatment, and applying the information is at the listener's own risk.